Elijah James, a successful black CEO, is racially profiled and targeted by Officer Daniels, a corrupt police officer, based on his appearance and status. Despite having done nothing wrong, Elijah is accused of car theft, with Daniels showing clear racial bias and making degrading remarks about Elijah's success, suggesting it's undeserved. As the officer continues to escalate the situation, it becomes evident that the injustice Elijah faces is part of a larger pattern of systemic racism and abuse of power. Tensions rise as Elijah is forced to confront the deep-rooted racism embedded in law enforcement. The bus was almost empty, save for a few scattered passengers in their seats, lost in their thoughts. Sophie tucked her purse closer to her side, the leather strap cool against her fingers. It had been a long day at work, and all she wanted now was to head home, get some rest, and forget about the chaotic whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and the never-ending rush. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, Sophie leaned back against the worn seat, her eyes drifting toward the window. The sky was a dull shade of gray, a reflection of her mood. It had been one of those days, nothing extraordinary, just the kind of day that wears you down with its quiet weight. The bus stopped abruptly at a red light, and Sophie's gaze shifted to the man who had boarded at the last stop. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket that was slightly too big for him, his hair unkempt as if he hadn't bothered to comb it that morning. He stood by the door, his eyes scanning the bus before they landed on Sophie. She offered a polite smile, not wanting to appear rude, but he didn't smile back. Instead, he moved toward the seat next to her. The suddenness of his approach made Sophie's heart rate pick up slightly, though she quickly dismissed the feeling. After all, it was just a man looking for a place to sit. But as he reached the seat, something about the way he lingered in front of her, his eyes not meeting hers, his body tense, made Sophie hesitate. Her hand instinctively gripped her purse tighter. She had been a woman in this city long enough to know when something felt off. It wasn't the man's appearance that unsettled her. It was the cold, unnerving energy he carried, as if he expected something from her. She glanced around the bus. No one else seemed to notice. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice low, almost inaudible. Sophie didn't know if he was addressing her or just talking to himself. She looked up from her lap, where her fingers had begun to tap nervously. "I think you're in my seat," he said again, this time a little louder. Sophie blinked, confused. "Sorry?" "This is my seat," he repeated, gesturing toward the space beside her. For a moment, Sophie was unsure of how to respond. She had boarded the bus early enough to choose her seat, and there was no sign indicating that any specific seat belonged to someone else. She looked at him again, his posture rigid, as if daring her to argue. Her pulse quickened. "I'm not sure what you mean. I don't think this seat is taken," she said cautiously, trying to keep her voice steady. But she was beginning to feel uncomfortable, the strange sensation of being in a standoff creeping in. The man stared at her for a beat too long. Sophie shifted in her seat, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Something about this encounter was about to escalate. She could feel it in her gut. Then, as if deciding something in his head, the man took a step back and moved toward the next row, sitting down with an audible sigh. Sophie breathed out a small sigh of relief, but the tension in her chest didn't dissipate. She could still feel his eyes on her, his presence like a shadow looming at the edge of her consciousness. What she hadn't noticed, though, was the woman seated across from her, who had witnessed the whole exchange. She was watching Sophie now, her eyes narrowing with an unreadable expression. The coffee shop was nearly empty that Thursday morning, save for a few stragglers hunched over their laptops. The soft tapping of keys, a steady rhythm against the backdrop of smooth jazz playing from the overhead speakers. The barista, a young man with dark-rimmed glasses, nodded in greeting as the door swung open, a gust of cool morning air carrying in the scent of fresh rain. In walked Elijah James, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in every corner of the city that needed a sharp mind and steady hand. But in this small coffee shop, tucked into a corner of the city's bustling financial district, he was just another customer, nothing more than the man who took his seat by the window, looking out at the streets as if he didn't own half the city. Elijah wasn't one to flaunt his power. At 52, he had long abandoned the need to assert his authority over others. His reputation, built over years of careful strategy and unyielding ambition, spoke for him. He was the CEO of a growing tech company that had disrupted an entire industry. He sat on the board of multiple philanthropic organizations, and his influence reached into the highest echelons of local politics. But none of that mattered in here. In the coffee shop, where the rain-soaked streets outside reflected the bright lights of the city, he was just a man in a black jacket, jeans and sneakers, casually slipping his phone from his pocket to check for messages, just like everyone else. He didn't want to be the type to stand out. There was something about the anonymity of this place, the way no one expected anything from him, that drew him in. No one asked for his autograph or a handshake, and they didn't care about his wealth or position. That suited him just fine. Elijah had spent his life navigating a world that saw his blackness before his brilliance, his wealth before his worth. But in here, in the quiet hum of the coffee shop, he could simply exist, without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on him. The barista set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The usual?" he asked, his voice pleasant, as though this were the most ordinary interaction. "Yeah," Elijah replied, nodding, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. He wasn't the kind of man who ever sought attention, but he appreciated when someone recognized the value of routine. He took a sip, savoring the dark roast as the warm liquid slid down his throat. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up in earnest, the usual early morning rush, the honking of car horns, the shuffle of feet on sidewalks, the sound of business being conducted on every corner. It was a familiar rhythm, one he had become attuned to after years of pushing through obstacles, both professional and personal. He had faced more than his share of microaggressions, whispered judgments, and challenges, ones that people like him knew all too well. Even in his position, the racism was subtle, yet relentless. He could walk into a room full of potential investors and watch them scrutinize him as if his success were somehow a fluke. But Elijah never let it show. He knew what it meant to be underestimated, and he had learned to use it to his advantage. Today, however, the city was not his concern. Elijah had a rare moment of peace, and he intended to savor it. His thoughts drifted to the work he had left behind, the board meetings, the new project proposal that still needed approval, the charity event he would attend that evening. All important, no doubt, but for now, he let the world outside fade into the background. The bell above the door jingled again, and Elijah glanced up from his coffee. A woman in her late 20s, with a sharp, professional air about her, entered. She wore a tailored jacket over a crisp blouse and dark trousers, her phone already in hand, as she scanned the shop for an open seat. Elijah looked away, not wanting to draw attention, but his eyes caught her again as she walked past him. There was something familiar about her, not her face, but her posture. Something about the way she moved suggested she was accustomed to authority, accustomed to commanding a room. Without thinking, he stood up, half an instinctive motion, half an act of courtesy. She looked back at him, as if surprised by his movement. Their eyes met for a brief moment, before she smiled, shaking her head slightly. "Thank you, but I'm just going to grab a seat over there," she said, gesturing toward an empty table near the window. Her voice was calm, confident, but there was a trace of something in her tone, something Elijah couldn't quite place. He nodded, and sat back down, though something about the encounter lingered in his mind. There was a subtle power in her presence, an unspoken understanding that they were both, in some way, playing the same game. Minutes passed, and the woman's phone conversation grew louder as she spoke to someone on the other end. Elijah tried to ignore the sharpness of her words, but her frustration was palpable. She was clearly in the midst of a business call, negotiating something, trying to resolve an issue. His thoughts drifted back to his own work, negotiations deals. People trying to make their mark, to climb higher. He'd done his share of that, had weathered his own share of tense conversations, where every word mattered. He couldn't help but wonder if she was in a similar position, dealing with her own challenges. But what caught his attention was the tone of the conversation. It was not the typical confident, assertive language one would expect from someone in her position. There was an edge of disbelief, almost as if she couldn't fathom the situation she was in. His curiosity piqued, Elijah leaned slightly forward, trying to catch a better sense of the conversation. "I just don't understand why they keep undermining me," the woman said, her voice dropping slightly, but still audible enough for Elijah to hear. I've been doing this job for 5 years, and they still treat me like I don't belong here. Elijah's mind shifted. That was a line he knew well. In his own career, he had often faced similar dismissals, sometimes in ways that felt almost deliberate. People questioning his qualifications, doubting his worth, as if the color of his skin made him less deserving of his success. He'd never shown it. Of course, he'd always played the part of the composed professional, pushing back with tact and patience, biding his time until he could prove them wrong. The woman's words, however, hit closer to home than he expected. There was something deeply familiar in them. He had been there, in that very space of frustration, of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, some people would always see him through the narrow lens of their biases. She finished the call and sighed, running her hand through her hair in exasperation. For a moment, Elijah considered offering a few words of advice, just as he might with a colleague. But then he stopped himself. He didn't know her, and besides, that wasn't his role today. He wasn't here to save anyone, nor was he interested in becoming another person who tried to fix the world's wrongs, especially not without being asked. Instead, Elijah returned his attention to the window, watching the light shift as the clouds parted, letting a bit of sunshine filter through. He was content with the quiet, with the routine. But as he sat there, he couldn't help but wonder if, for all his power, for all the success he had achieved, he would ever truly be seen as more than what others assumed of him. And so, Elijah James, the man who had everything but nothing to prove, sat quietly, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of his coffee cup. The world outside seemed unchanged. But for him, the question lingered in the air. How much longer could he keep pretending that it didn't matter? With the scene now set, and Elijah established as the protagonist, his power, humility, and internal struggles laid bare, this section creates the foundation for the rest of the story, with subtle hints of systemic prejudice and brewing conflicts to come. The tone remains conversational yet poignant, with room for the conflict to unfold organically. Elijah's thoughts drifted as the morning hours passed. His coffee was cold now, untouched, the world outside moving quickly, while he sat still, enveloped by the hum of casual conversation and the quiet comfort of his usual space. The air smelled faintly of roasting beans and freshly baked pastries, a pleasant distraction from the gravity of the day ahead. He wasn't sure why, but something about this particular morning felt different. Maybe it was the unspoken tension in the coffee shop, a feeling he couldn't shake. Or perhaps it was the conversation he overheard just moments ago, the woman's words echoing in his mind. I've been doing this job for 5 years, and they still treat me like I don't belong here. He wondered, for a brief second, whether that was how others viewed him, whether they saw him as the token black CEO, the exception that proved the rule, rather than recognizing his accomplishments for what they were. Elijah shook the thought away. He had worked too hard to get where he was, and he wasn't about to let anyone diminish that. But as he gathered his belongings, preparing to leave, the subtle weight of the world outside pressed in once again. The door chimed softly, and he stepped outside, the cool air rushing at him like a greeting. As he made his way down the sidewalk, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder about a board meeting. That afternoon, Elijah sighed, glancing up at the looming office buildings around him, each one a symbol of his long journey. He was used to the hustle, the constant pressure, the unrelenting pace of it all. But that didn't make it any easier. As he walked toward his car, parked a few blocks away, a sudden sense of unease settled over him. It wasn't the city or the people. It was something deeper, something he had felt countless times before, but never fully embraced. The constant, gnawing awareness that he was always being watched, always being judged, always being perceived in ways that had nothing to do with his character or abilities. As much as he had achieved, Elijah knew that his success could never fully escape the lens of race, the expectations others placed on him simply because of the color of his skin. That thought hung heavy in the air as he reached his car, a sleek black sedan that stood in stark contrast to the nearby parking meters and abandoned bicycles. Elijah reached for the door handle. But before he could open it, a voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, sir, can I talk to you for a moment?" Elijah turned slowly, expecting to see someone in need, perhaps a homeless person or a lost tourist. Instead, he found himself face to face with a uniformed police officer, his hand resting on the side of his cruiser. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, the familiar tension immediately gripping him. It was a feeling he had come to know well over the years. The unspoken assumption that someone in authority would challenge his right to exist, even in spaces where he had every right to be. "Is there a problem?" Elijah asked, his voice calm, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had dealt with this before. Being questioned on his way to a meeting, being pulled over for reasons that made no sense, all because of the color of his skin. The officer, a tall man with a thick mustache, looked him over carefully, his eyes lingering on Elijah's face. There was a hint of suspicion in the officer's gaze, as though he was trying to place Elijah's face, to determine if he was someone important or just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Just a quick question," the officer said, his tone casual but authoritative. "What are you doing here?" Elijah paused. "I'm headed to work," he said, maintaining eye contact. He was always careful with his words, always aware of how even the smallest deviation could be used against him. He gestured toward his car, trying to make it clear that he was simply going about his business. The officer's expression didn't change. "You sure we've had some reports of suspicious activity around here lately? Just want to make sure everything's in order." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I assure you, officer, I'm not involved in any suspicious activity." He emphasized the words, though he felt the familiar stirrings of frustration. He could already see the officer's mind working, the way he was processing Elijah's appearance, his dark skin, his sharp suit, his black sedan, as though they didn't belong together. The officer took a step closer, his gaze flickering toward the car again. "You mind if I take a look inside?" Elijah's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had learned long ago how to navigate situations like this. The moment he protested, the moment he became defensive, the narrative would shift in an instant. The officer would have a reason to escalate, and Elijah knew that was the last thing he needed. "I don't see why that's necessary," Elijah replied evenly, his voice controlled. "I'm simply going to work, officer. I'm sure you can verify my license plate if you need to." The officer's eyes flicked toward Elijah's face again, scanning for any sign of resistance. It was as if he were searching for the tiniest excuse to assert his authority, to remind Elijah that despite his success, despite the car he drove, or the suit he wore, he was still subject to the rules of a world that saw him first as black. "I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, just making sure," the officer said, his voice lowering, though the condescension was evident in his tone. Elijah's patience began to wear thin. He wasn't a man who liked to be questioned, certainly not when there was no basis for it. But he kept his composure, fighting the rising tide of anger. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, thoughts of all the times he had been stopped, questioned, and dismissed, simply because he didn't fit the mold of what a successful black man was supposed to look like. "Officer, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me be on my way," Elijah said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "If I've broken any laws, I'll be happy to address it in the appropriate manner. But at the moment, I'm just trying to get to work." For a long moment the officer didn't speak. He simply stared at Elijah, as if weighing his options. Elijah could feel the tension crackling in the air, the unspoken judgment that lingered between them. Finally, the officer seemed to make a decision, his posture relaxing ever so slightly. "All right," he said, taking a step back, "but you'll be hearing from us if there's any reason to follow up." Elijah nodded curtly. "Of course, officer, thank you." As the officer returned to his cruiser, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he had just passed a test he had passed countless times before, but which never seemed to get easier. He climbed into his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel, the brief encounter gnawing at him. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, frustration, anger, resignation. It wasn't just that this had happened again, it was that he had expected it. That part of him always braced for it, no matter where he was or what he was doing. But Elijah had learned, over the years, how to suppress the anger, how to keep his composure, even when every fiber of his being screamed to fight back. He had learned that the world wasn't always fair, and that being black in a world that wasn't designed for him meant that he had to prove his worth, over and over again, in ways others never had to. He exhaled slowly, trying to center himself as he started the engine and pulled away. But as he drove down the busy streets, heading toward his office, the weight of it all pressed on him once again. The constant vigilance, the quiet indignities, the nagging sense that no matter how far he climbed, the world would always see him as less than what he had become. With the escalation of this initial conflict, Elijah's experience of discrimination and the internal struggle to maintain composure is established. The tone deepens as he navigates subtle and overt biases, highlighting his ongoing frustration with the systemic challenges he faces. The audience is now fully aligned with his plight, setting the stage for the pivotal turning point to come. The tension that had been simmering all day erupted with a suddenness Elijah could never have anticipated. After his brief encounter with the officer, the drive to his office had been a blur, streets flashing by, his thoughts racing faster than the cars on the road. He arrived at his office building, the sleek glass structure towering above him, promising sanctuary from the frustrations of the outside world. But the sense of unease never left him. It clung to him like a shadow, one he couldn't escape, no matter how much he tried. The elevator ride up was quiet. Too quiet. Elijah felt the weight of the day bearing down on him as the doors slid open to reveal the modern, minimalist lobby. His assistant, Michelle, was at her desk, the phone pressed to her ear, her fingers flying across her keyboard. She gave him a quick wave as he passed, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Elijah's brow furrowed as he made his way to his office. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break wide open. As he entered the space, his executive team was already gathered, the usual suspects sitting around the large conference table. The mood was tense, a stark contrast to the usual upbeat banter that greeted him in meetings. He nodded at the members as he walked in, his eyes immediately catching the grim expression on Mitchell's face. Mitchell, a longtime colleague, was one of the few people Elijah trusted implicitly in a world full of backstabbers. The man had always been quiet, analytical, someone who avoided unnecessary drama, but now, his unease was palpable. "Mitchell, what's going on?" Elijah asked, his voice low but firm as he took his seat. The others glanced at one another, their eyes flickering nervously. "There's been an incident," Mitchell began, his voice laced with hesitation. "We got a call from the local precinct, someone in the police department. Well, they're saying that the car you were driving earlier today doesn't match their records. Apparently, it was reported stolen, and they've flagged you as a person of interest." Elijah's heart sank. The words hung in the air, thick with disbelief. His mind raced as he processed the information. He knew the car wasn't stolen. He had bought it 6 months ago, fully documented, everything in order. But the mere fact that the local precinct had flagged it was enough to put him on the defensive. It wasn't about the car, it was about the system that had been waiting for a reason to target him. This was the game he had been playing all his life, the one where his success meant nothing when compared to the color of his skin. "Are you telling me they flagged me as a criminal?" Elijah asked, keeping his voice even, but the anger was starting to bubble beneath the surface. "Based on what, a hunch?" Mitchell swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. "Not a hunch, exactly. They said it was part of an ongoing investigation into stolen vehicles in the area. But it looks like your license plate came up in their system." "Mitchell, this doesn't make any sense," Elijah said, standing abruptly. He could feel his pulse quickening, his chest tightening. He took a few steps toward the window, the cityscape stretching out before him like a reminder of everything he had built and everything that could come crashing down. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an attack. A systematic attack on his character, on his achievements. The moment he had tried to slip through the cracks unnoticed, the system had found him. "There has to be some mistake. I'll call my lawyer," Elijah muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. He was already strategizing, already thinking about how to fix the situation, how to fight back. But it wasn't just about this moment anymore. It was about the years of similar situations, all piling up into something bigger, something more dangerous. Mitchell nodded, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. Elijah turned to face him, his expression hardening. "What's going on, Mitchell?" he demanded. "You've been quiet since I walked in. What else haven't you told me?" Mitchell hesitated for a beat too long before he spoke again. "They're coming for you, Elijah. The police are sending a car here. They're going to try and bring you in for questioning." A chill ran down Elijah's spine. His stomach clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "For questioning about what exactly?" "They're going to say you're under investigation for fraud. For the car, I think they're looking for a way to tie you into something bigger." Maybe they think you're laundering money or something." Elijah's blood ran cold. He felt the sharp edge of rage, but he buried it quickly. He couldn't afford to lose his temper now. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about everything he represented: his company, his reputation, his legacy. "I don't care what they think," Elijah said, his voice a low growl. "I know the truth, and I'm not going to let them take me down over some fabricated nonsense." The door to the office opened with a soft creak, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, followed by 2 other men in plain clothes. Elijah's stomach tightened again, but he kept his composure, his eyes locking with the officer's, as he stood up from the chair. There was no mistaking the intent in the air. The officer had no interest in small talk, no interest in any explanation. "We need to speak with you, Mr. James," the officer said, his voice gruff. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't offer any courtesy, just a cold demand. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elijah replied, his voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of fury. "You have no right to take me in." The officer's expression didn't change. "You're under investigation for suspected involvement in a car theft ring. We need you to come with us for questioning." Elijah's mind raced as he took a step forward, his body tense, but his voice steady. He could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building around him, pushing against him. He could see Mitchell's anxious expression out of the corner of his eye. The other employees in the room standing frozen, unsure how to react. He had no idea how they would respond if things escalated, but he couldn't let that concern distract him. "What kind of investigation is this?" Elijah asked, his voice firm, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. He knew he needed to stay calm, to not give them any excuse to make a move. "I've done nothing wrong, my car is not stolen, and I have all the documentation to prove it." The officer didn't blink. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself downtown. For now, we need you to come with us." Elijah clenched his fists at his sides, the rush of adrenaline pulsing through him. The system was once again trying to pull him under, to undermine everything he had worked for. But this time, he wouldn't let it happen. He knew his rights, knew how to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy that had been designed to trap people like him. This wasn't just about the car, it was about everything that had been building beneath the surface. Every snub, every slight, every time someone questioned his worth. It was all culminating here, and now, Elijah could feel the tipping point coming. "No," Elijah said, his voice sharp. "You're not taking me anywhere. Not without cause." The officer's eyes flickered toward his colleagues, and there was an instant of silent communication, a shift in the room that made everything feel like it was about to explode. Mitchell stepped forward, his face pale. "Elijah, maybe you should just go with them. It's better if we handle this calmly." But Elijah was done being calm. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up to the system that had been built to silence people like him. He wasn't going to let them get away with this, not this time. "No," Elijah said again, his voice rising. "I'm not going anywhere." At that moment, the door to the office swung open again, this time with more urgency. Elijah didn't turn, but he could feel the shift in the room. He knew, deep down, that this was the moment everything changed. The tension is at its peak, and Elijah's refusal to back down sets the stage for the climactic confrontation. The stakes are high, and the injustice he faces becomes impossible to ignore. His internal struggle between anger and composure mirrors the growing external conflict, building anticipation for the next pivotal phase. The room fell deathly silent as Elijah's refusal echoed in the air. The officer's stern expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to see the flicker of frustration. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. Not by someone who was so clearly out of his reach. Elijah could see it in his eyes. The officer's unspoken belief that a man like Elijah should know his place, should know that the system was built to keep him in line, but Elijah wasn't having it. Not today. Not anymore. "You don't get to walk in here, barge into my office, and tell me I'm under investigation for a crime I didn't commit," Elijah said, his voice steady but cutting. "You're going to need more than just an accusation to make me walk out of here." The officer, whose nameplate read Daniels, stared at him as if trying to read him. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't waver. He had been in situations like this before, where every glance, every word, every movement was scrutinized. He had built his empire by holding his ground in boardrooms and courtrooms. But this moment, right here, felt like something different. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a deal. This was about control, about a system that sought to break him, to remind him of his place, and Elijah would not let it happen. The officers behind Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke. Mitchell, standing near the conference table, looked at Elijah, his face filled with concern. He could see the wheels turning in Elijah's mind, the quiet, internal battle that was being waged between fighting back and keeping everything above board. Mitchell opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not going with you," Elijah repeated, this time louder, more resolute. "You don't have a warrant, you don't have anything to hold me on, and until you do, I'm staying right here." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You're making a big mistake, Mr. James. I don't care who you think you are. I'm doing my job and you're going to come with me whether you like it or not." Elijah's jaw clenched. He could feel the heat of anger rising within him, but he knew that showing it would be his downfall. Anger was the one thing they expected, the one thing that could be used against him. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he prepared for the storm he knew was coming. "No, Officer Daniels. You're the one making a mistake," Elijah said, the words deliberate, controlled. "You're the one that's about to make this all go very public. This isn't just about me, this is about everyone else who's been treated like this, the system that thinks it can take down anyone who doesn't fit the mold. But I'm not going to let you do that to me." Mitchell took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension, but it was too late. The officers were already positioning themselves, and there was no getting out of it now. "Enough of this," Daniels growled, his voice low but filled with authority. "Get him." The officers lunged forward, but before they could even lay a hand on him, Elijah's mind raced. He wasn't going to be arrested, not today. Not for something he didn't do. He had been through too much, fought too hard, to be dragged down by this. His hand shot out to grab his phone from the desk, and with one fluid motion, he dialed his lawyer's number. His thumb hovered over the dial as the officers came closer, but he didn't hesitate. He pressed the button. "Glenn, get here now. They're trying to arrest me. I'm not leaving without you." The officer's grip tightened on his arm, but Elijah yanked it away, his eyes still locked on Daniels. "I'm calling my lawyer. You want to take me down for something I didn't do? You're going to have to do it the right way. And that starts with a warrant." Daniels's face contorted in rage. The silence in the room grew heavier as the seconds ticked by. The officers were still circling Elijah, but they were hesitating now. They didn't want this to go public. They didn't want to escalate things any further. They wanted to get him out, to make him disappear quietly. Elijah's fingers tightened around his phone. He could hear Glenn's voice on the other end, low but urgent. "Elijah. What the hell is going on? They're trying to arrest me for a crime I didn't commit. I need you to get here now. Call in every favor you can," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. There was a beat of silence before Glenn responded. "On my way, don't move." Elijah hung up the phone and slowly turned his attention back to Officer Daniels. The tension in the room was palpable. Mitchell was now standing in the corner, watching the scene unfold, his face a mix of concern and confusion. Elijah could feel his presence, feel the weight of the man's loyalty. Mitchell wanted to help, wanted to do something, but Elijah knew this wasn't his fight. It was Elijah's. "Let's get one thing straight," Elijah said, his voice cold as ice. "You can drag me out of here, but you're not going to take me down. Not like this, not without proof." Daniels stepped forward, his hands raised, but Elijah took a half step back, his body positioned in a way that was both defensive and determined. He wasn't going to let them take him without a fight. Not a physical fight, but a legal one. He could already feel the gears of strategy turning in his mind. "Let's see how long that cocky attitude lasts when you're sitting in a cell," Daniels spat, his voice thick with disdain. "But it won't be long, you'll be begging for a way out." Elijah held Daniels' gaze, unflinching. "You really don't get it, do you? You're about to make a mistake that's going to cost you everything. This isn't about you and me, this is about the system you represent, and it's about time someone took it down." Just as Daniels took another step toward him, the elevator dinged, and the doors opened. Elijah's lawyer, Glenn, stepped into the room with two other attorneys at his side. The change in the atmosphere was immediate, as the officers froze, clearly surprised by the sudden arrival of legal reinforcements. Glenn's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his presence commanding. Elijah turned toward him, his jaw tight, but his voice steady. "They're trying to arrest me, Glenn, for a car they say I don't own, and for a crime I didn't commit." Glenn's eyes flicked toward the officers, and for a moment, there was silence. Elijah could feel the standoff intensifying as the lawyers began to strategize, glancing between each other and the officers, calculating their next move. Mitchell, still standing near the door, finally spoke up, his voice quiet but insistent. "We don't have to take this. There's no evidence, no grounds for an arrest. We know what this is." Glenn nodded sharply. "Exactly. This is harassment, and it stops now." The tension in the room was palpable as the officers' resolve seemed to waver for the first time. The standoff wasn't over, but the odds had shifted. Elijah could feel the surge of hope, the first crack in the dam of this injustice. But it wasn't finished yet. This wasn't over. Daniels looked between his colleagues, then back to Glenn and Elijah. He knew the weight of this moment was bigger than just an arrest. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was about something much larger. Something that threatened to expose the systemic rot he and others like him had worked so hard to protect. Elijah's chest rose and fell with every breath. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but he knew how to channel it now. He was ready to take action, ready to make them face the consequences of their choices. The door swung open again, this time with a finality that made everyone pause. The next phase of this battle was about to begin. The stakes have reached their peak, as Elijah faces the unjust threat of arrest, challenging the system's biases and corruption. His resolve has been tested, but he's ready to take action with the help of his allies. The anticipation is now set for the climactic confrontation. The room felt suffocating now. The air was thick with tension, crackling with the static of impending conflict. Elijah could feel every muscle in his body taut with the weight of the moment. Every breath a controlled inhale against the storm, brewing around him. The officers stood in front of him, their presence a constant reminder of the system that had been trying to hold him back his entire life. Officer Daniels, the most vocal among them, stood with his arms crossed, glaring at him with barely contained animosity. His colleagues flanked him, their expressions a mixture of hesitation and loyalty. But it was Daniels who carried the fire. The one who had been pushing this unjust arrest from the start. Glenn, Elijah's lawyer, stood beside him, his jaw clenched. Behind him, two more lawyers from the firm had arrived, their eyes sharp, ready to fight this in any way they could. But it wasn't just about the lawyers anymore, it wasn't about the paperwork or the legal tactics, it was about Elijah standing firm against an unjust system, a system that had never fully accepted him, no matter how successful he had become. And right now, it was going to push him to his breaking point. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Daniels," Elijah said, his voice calm, but filled with unwavering strength. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a line in the sand drawn between the two of them. "I'm not leaving my office unless you show me something that proves I've done something wrong. Your investigation is a joke." Daniels sneered, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "You think you can intimidate me with your fancy suits and your lawyers, huh? You think because you have money and a name you're untouchable?" He took a step closer, his body bristling with disdain. "You're not special, Mr. James. You're just another criminal in a suit, and today, you're going to learn the hard way that no one is above the law." Elijah felt the blood rise in his veins, but he refused to let the anger control him. He had been down this road before, countless times, facing the prejudice of a system built to keep people like him in line. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just going to play by their rules, he was going to expose them for what they really were. "You think I'm just another criminal? You don't even know me," Elijah shot back, his voice low but heavy with the weight of every injustice he had endured. "What you don't realize, Daniels, is that this isn't about me. This is about everything that's wrong with the way people like you look at people like me. It's not just about this car. This is about a system that's been built to crush people of color, to make them feel like they don't belong. But I'm done with that." For a moment, Daniels's expression faltered, his eyes flickering with a mixture of surprise and anger. But before he could respond, Elijah continued, his words cutting deeper than any physical confrontation ever could. "You've been feeding into this for so long, haven't you?" Elijah's voice rose slightly, the weight of his words starting to hit. "Every time you see someone like me, you think you have the right to question, to challenge, to hold us to a different standard. But you're not even seeing me, you're seeing what you want to see, and you think you can get away with it because you're the one holding the power. You think your badge gives you permission to treat me like this." Daniels took a step back, his fists clenching at his sides. Elijah's words were landing now, the uncomfortable truth about to come crashing down on him. It was clear that Daniels hadn't expected Elijah to fight back this way, hadn't anticipated someone standing up to the authority he wielded like a weapon. "You don't know what it's like," Daniels spat. "You don't know what it's like to have to deal with your kind every day. People like you, always thinking they can get away with anything. You think because you're sitting at the top, you don't have to follow the rules. You think the world owes you something." Elijah's heart hammered in his chest, but his resolve was as solid as it had ever been. "People like me. What's that supposed to mean? You don't get to talk to me like that. I've worked my ass off to get where I am. I didn't get here because of some handout, and I didn't get here by making people uncomfortable. I got here because I'm damn good at what I do, and that terrifies people like you." The silence in the room was deafening. The tension between them was so thick, it almost felt like the walls were closing in. Daniels looked like he wanted to lash out, but he hesitated. The quiet was broken by the sound of the elevator again, its soft chime signaling more reinforcements, this time from a different part of the building. But Elijah didn't look up. He didn't need to. His focus was entirely on Daniels, who was visibly shaken by the words Elijah had just thrown at him. "This is where it ends, Daniels," Elijah said, his voice firm. "This is where the lie ends. You want to keep pushing this fine. You're about to learn what happens when someone refuses to be intimidated." Daniels sneered and took a step closer. "You're going to regret this, Mr. James. I told you, you're not above the law." But Elijah was done. He was done with the system, done with the assumptions, done with the way people like Daniels thought they could break him. The truth was clearer now than it had ever been. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every black man and woman who had been subjected to this kind of treatment. He was fighting for the people who had been silenced by a system that worked tirelessly to oppress them. He took a breath, steadying himself. The time for words was over. Now, it was time for action. "Glenn," Elijah called out, his voice ringing through the tense room. "Let's expose this for what it is." Glenn nodded immediately, a signal that they were ready to move forward. He had been Elijah's legal counsel for years, and the trust between them ran deep. Elijah knew that this moment would test the strength of their strategy, the carefully crafted plan that had been brewing ever since Daniel's arrival. With a swift motion, Glenn pulled out his phone and began to record the encounter, the lens capturing every word, every movement, every moment of tension. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniels demanded, noticing the phone. "You think recording me is going to change anything?" "No," Elijah replied, his tone calm, unshaken. "But it's going to change the way everyone sees you." Daniel's face twisted in fury as he rushed toward Elijah. But before he could make another move, Glenn spoke, his voice ringing with authority. "You have no right to intimidate my client, Officer Daniels," Glenn said, his words clear and sharp. "And you certainly have no right to escalate this further without cause. You're on record now, and any further action on your part will be held against you." The officer hesitated, his anger rising to the surface. But as he looked around the room, the gravity of the situation started to sink in. The other officers were no longer looking at Elijah with the same certainty they had when they first entered the room. The presence of the lawyers, the recording, the mounting pressure from Elijah's words, all of it was beginning to take hold. Daniels knew that any further escalation could have severe consequences. "What do you think you're going to do with all this?" Daniels spat, trying to salvage some of his authority. Elijah's gaze never left him, his expression unwavering. "We're going to use it to show everyone exactly who you are." In that moment, the tension reached its peak. Daniels had no more words, no more excuses. He was standing on the edge, and Elijah had just shown him how far the drop really was. Then, as if on cue, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't more officers or more lawyers. It was the head of security for the building, walking in with a brisk stride, his face neutral but stern. He had been called in as a precaution after the earlier confrontation escalated. His eyes quickly scanned the room, assessing the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp. "This man is attempting to arrest my client without cause," Glenn replied immediately, his voice full of resolve. "We've already informed him that there's no legal reason to hold Mr. James, and yet he's continuing to try and escalate the situation." The security head glanced at Daniels, then back at Elijah, and it was clear from his expression that he understood the weight of the moment. He nodded curtly. "Officer Daniels, I think you need to step outside." Daniels hesitated, then clenched his fists in frustration. With a final glare at Elijah, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door, followed by the other officers. The tension began to dissipate, but the damage was done. Elijah had made his stand, and the world was watching. The confrontation reached its climax, with Elijah turning the tide in his favor by using his resolve, strategic thinking, and the support of his allies. The officers' true prejudices were exposed, but the room was left with uncertainty. Daniels had retreated, but what would happen next? The stakes are high, and the resolution remains just out of reach. The room was thick with anticipation. Every breath felt heavier, the walls seemed to close in, and time itself stretched out, each second pulling the tension tighter and tighter. Elijah stood at the center, his body tense, but his mind focused. Officer Daniels was still standing before him, just inches away, his face twisted in a combination of disbelief and anger. The officers flanking him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between their leader and Elijah, as if unsure which side of this escalating confrontation to take. The door had barely closed behind Glenn, the lawyer, and the other reinforcements, when Daniels took another step forward. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "You think you're special, don't you, Mr. James? All this money, all this success, and you still think you're above everyone else. You think the rules don't apply to you." Elijah's pulse quickened, but his exterior remained unshaken. He had been in high-stakes meetings, where his every word had to be measured, where the smallest misstep could cost millions. This was no different. He understood how the system worked, how people like Daniels were determined to make their lives harder, simply because they saw him as an outsider in the world of wealth and influence. "No, officer," Elijah said, his voice calm but resolute. "I think the rules do apply, but you don't get to dictate what happens based on your personal assumptions about me." The words hit their mark, but Daniels wasn't ready to back down. "You think you can just throw your weight around and I'll back off? You think because you've got a lawyer in here, I'm going to let you get away with this?" He sneered as he stepped even closer, his breath heavy with frustration. Elijah felt the pressure mount. His lawyers had arrived, and now there were multiple voices in the room weighing in on the situation, but Daniels was still the one holding the power. The officer was used to having the upper hand, but Elijah wasn't backing down. "You're the one here trying to take me down," Elijah said, his tone sharp but controlled. "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone. I'm trying to get answers for why I've been dragged into this without cause. You've made an accusation, but there's no evidence." Daniels glared at him, eyes narrowing, and for a moment, Elijah thought the officer might lunge at him, but then something shifted. A flicker of recognition perhaps, or the realization that his posture was betraying his power. Daniels' voice wavered slightly, but the venom remained. "You don't get it, do you?" Daniels said, his voice quiet, yet somehow even more dangerous. "This isn't about you, it's about keeping the order in place. People like you, people who rise too high, too fast, they think they can play by their own rules, they forget who they owe everything to, and people like me, we make sure they remember." The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air, but Elijah remained stoic. This wasn't the first time he'd heard the undercurrent of prejudice. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to dismiss him, diminish his success, or make him feel like an imposter. But this time, there would be no tolerance for it. This time, it was going to be different. "What you're saying," Elijah began, his voice even but piercing, "is that you believe people who look like me shouldn't be allowed to succeed, that people who don't fit your idea of what success should look like are a threat." But let me tell you something. I didn't get here by chance. I didn't get here because I play by a different set of rules. I got here because I work harder, think smarter, and refuse to let people like you decide my worth." The air seemed to still. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Elijah saw a flicker of something other than righteous indignation in the officer's eyes, a crack in his armor. For a moment, it looked like Daniels might say something, but instead, he took a step back, pulling his gaze away from Elijah. The officer's hands trembled, just slightly, and for the first time, Elijah saw the truth of it. The officer was feeling the pressure. His authority was slipping. His belief that he could control this situation was unraveling. "You think you can just stand there, talking about merit and hard work? Like it means anything?" Daniels snapped, his voice rising again, laced with venom. "You wouldn't be in that chair without people like me protecting you. The reason you're sitting here today is because we let you." A sick realization hit Elijah like a wave crashing into a rock. This wasn't just about power or control. This wasn't just about him being accused of a crime he didn't commit. Daniels's words revealed the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath the surface. This was about an entire system built on inequality, a system designed to keep people like him down, to remind them that no matter how much they accomplished, there would always be someone in a position of power telling them they didn't belong. "Let me make something clear to you, Officer Daniels," Elijah said, his voice unwavering, every word deliberate. "You didn't make me. You didn't give me anything, and you can't take anything from me. This system you keep referring to, it's broken. And people like you are the ones who keep it alive, but you don't scare me." Daniel's face twisted in disgust, the mask of professional indifference he had worn so far slipping, revealing the depths of his prejudice. Elijah had made him see something that he didn't want to face: his own complicity in an unjust system. Daniels was shaken, but he still had the upper hand, and he wasn't ready to give that up. "You're just one man, James," Daniels spat. "One black man with a lot of money, but it doesn't change what you are. It doesn't change what any of you are." The word struck harder than Elijah expected. It was as though Daniels had peeled back the layers of civility, revealing the true ugliness beneath. Elijah's heart raced, but he didn't allow the sting to show. His mind was clear, and his strategy was set. "People like you think you can keep others down," Elijah said, his words a cold declaration. "But I'm not your prisoner. Not now, not ever." At that moment, Glenn, his lawyer, stepped forward, his phone already raised, recording the entire conversation. "Enough, Officer Daniels. You've already crossed the line. This is harassment, and we have the evidence to prove it." Daniels froze for a moment, his face a mixture of fear and rage. He turned to his colleagues, looking for some semblance of support, but they were silent, unsure of how to respond. The cameras had captured it all: the words, the threats, the clear bias. It was no longer just a matter of Elijah's word against theirs. Now, there was undeniable evidence of Daniel's corruption and prejudice. "I'm done here," Elijah said, his voice low but full of finality. "And you're done too." The officer's face twisted in fury. "You think you can just walk away from this? You'll regret this, I'll make sure of it." Elijah stepped closer, his face inches from the officer's. He spoke slowly, making every word count. "I'm not walking away from anything, Daniels. You are, and when you're held accountable for this, don't think you'll get away with it. People like you don't scare me, they never have." In that moment, Daniel's rage was palpable. He took a step toward Elijah, but before he could act, the building security officer stepped in, his voice sharp and commanding. "Officer Daniels, I need you to leave the premises. Now," the security officer said firmly. He stepped between the two men, his presence undeniable. "You've been warned. Any further escalation, and I'll be calling internal affairs. You're done here." Daniels glared at the security officer, but the reality of the situation began to sink in. He was losing. He was the one in the wrong, and the world was starting to see it. He turned, muttering curses under his breath as he stormed out of the office, his colleagues following closely behind. As the door slammed shut, Elijah exhaled, the adrenaline beginning to ebb. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Glenn looked at him, a look of quiet admiration in his eyes. "You did it," Glenn said, his voice soft, but filled with relief. "They're done." But Elijah didn't feel the rush of victory he expected. Instead, he felt the weight of what had just happened, the revelation of just how deep the corruption and prejudice ran, and how hard he had fought to push back against it. He had won this battle, but the war that was far from over. The confrontation reached its peak, with Elijah exposing the systemic prejudice and corruption behind Officer Daniels's actions. His unwavering resolve and strategy turned the situation in his favor, but the emotional weight of the encounter still lingered. As Daniels was sent away in disgrace, the victory felt bittersweet. Elijah knew this was only the beginning. The dust was beginning to settle in the wake of the confrontation. Elijah stood in the center of the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His shoulders were tense, his mind racing, but there was also a sense of something else. Relief. The immediate threat had passed, but what followed would be a much larger battle, one that would continue to unfold over weeks, months, and perhaps even years. The system had been exposed, but the work to dismantle it was just beginning. Elijah glanced at Glenn, who had already started making calls, his voice steady but filled with purpose as he spoke with the building's legal team and the firm's associates. The moment was still raw, but it was clear. There was more to do. There would be follow-up meetings, legal proceedings, and a very public battle for justice. But Elijah wasn't worried about the next steps. What mattered most was that today, in this room, he had made his stand. "Elijah, you handled that better than I could have ever imagined," Glenn said, breaking his train of thought. "The evidence we've gathered, the recordings, Daniels's own words, it's all going to make waves. Internal affairs will be all over this, and we're not stopping here." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze drift toward the door where Daniels had stormed out, his defeated figure still lingering in the back of Elijah's mind. Daniels hadn't just been exposed for what he was. The officer had unwittingly shown the world how deeply embedded the biases and prejudices in the system ran, and for Elijah, that was the breakthrough. That was where the real work started. "Thank you, Glenn," Elijah finally said, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Glenn nodded. "No, it's not. But we've taken a big step today." The legal team moved quickly, coordinating with local authorities to ensure that the records of what had transpired in the office were submitted and reviewed. Glenn was already in contact with the media team, drafting statements and ensuring that the story would go public in a controlled, strategic way. Word about Officer Daniels' actions was about to spread, and Elijah knew the public would be watching, waiting for what came next. The building's security officer had promised to assist in the official filings, providing testimony and corroborating the evidence that would point to Daniels' abuse of power. But the true turning point came when a few key employees from the office came forward, quietly offering their support. They, too, had witnessed the tense moments, had heard the derogatory remarks, and had seen firsthand how the officer's attitude had shifted the second he realized who Elijah was. The employees knew that they couldn't stand idly by anymore, not when the truth was staring them in the face. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion of the day starting to weigh on him. He had been in the trenches before, fighting for every bit of respect he had earned, pushing against the biases that defined him before they even saw who he truly was. But this moment had felt different. There was something in the way he had stood his ground, the way the room had changed when the truth had been spoken so plainly, that felt like a shift in the air. It wasn't just the defeat of one officer, it was the beginning of a movement. Elijah knew that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was the tip of an iceberg, a call to action for everyone who had silently suffered under a system designed to keep them down. The fallout from the confrontation didn't take long to unfold. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. The recording Glenn had made, the evidence of Daniels's words, spread quickly through social media, igniting conversations about police misconduct, racial prejudice, and systemic corruption. The hashtag #Justice for Elijah went viral, with people across the country sharing their own experiences of racial profiling, unfair treatment, and being held accountable for actions they never committed. Elijah wasn't prepared for the outpouring of support. Messages flooded in, from everyday citizens to public figures, offering solidarity, encouragement, and calls for change. It was humbling and overwhelming, but as the story gained momentum, the pressure mounted. Elijah knew the fight was far from over. There would be backlash, attempts to discredit the evidence, and efforts to silence the voices speaking out. But that was the nature of change. It didn't come without resistance. The next few days were a blur of meetings, press releases, and legal wrangling. But amidst the chaos, Elijah found moments of peace. Moments when he could look at the broader picture and see the potential for change. This fight wasn't just for him anymore, it was for everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced by the systems in power. As Daniel's actions were officially investigated by Internal Affairs, his career began to unravel. His past conduct was called into question, with several other cases coming to light where his judgment and bias had clouded his actions. Daniels was suspended pending a full investigation, and it wasn't long before whispers of his potential dismissal began circulating. But even more significant than Daniel's downfall was the broader conversation that had been sparked. In the following weeks, Elijah was approached by civil rights organizations, activists, and policymakers, all eager to discuss the wider impact of his confrontation. What had started as a personal fight had now become a public battle, a battle that demanded reform within law enforcement and across institutions that were steeped in historical biases. Elijah was asked to speak at rallies, to participate in panels, and to share his story in ways he hadn't anticipated. The movement for justice, for racial equality, had been reignited, and he found himself in a position to lead, even if he hadn't expected it. Elijah sat in his office late one evening, the city lights outside twinkling like distant stars. His mind was occupied, reflecting on everything that had happened in the past few weeks. He could still feel the weight of the encounter with Daniels, the sting of those words that tried to cut him down. But now, more than ever, he understood the depth of his own power. It wasn't just about his achievements or his success, it was about using his voice, using his position to stand up against a system that had been designed to hold people like him back. In the quiet, his phone buzzed with a message from Mitchell. Elijah had been waiting for this update. It was an unofficial but promising report. Daniels had been dismissed from the force. The investigation had uncovered enough evidence to prove that his actions went far beyond a single isolated incident. He had a history of racial profiling, inappropriate behavior, and misconduct. His termination was imminent. But it wasn't just Daniels who was being exposed. Elijah's legal team had already begun working on the next phase of their efforts, using Daniels's case as a starting point to push for broader police reform. The implications of his story were far-reaching, and Elijah knew it would take time. But he also knew that real change was possible. The wheels were in motion, and he was at the forefront. Elijah's life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just a CEO or a businessman. He was now an advocate for justice, a leader in the fight against systemic oppression. He understood the weight of what that meant, and while he felt the exhaustion of the battle, he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was bigger than him. This was for everyone who had come before him, who had fought and lost, and for those who would come after him, who would inherit the struggle for equality and fairness. The emotional closure didn't come in the form of a single victory or resolution. It came in the quiet understanding that, while the battle was ongoing, he had contributed to something much larger than his own personal struggles. The injustice he had faced was not isolated. It was a shared experience that spanned generations, and now, he was part of something that had the power to make a real, lasting change. As he looked out the window, Elijah felt a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but the groundwork had been laid. There was still so much to do, still so much to fight for. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The system had been shaken, and though the road to justice would be long, he was ready to continue the fight. As the story of Elijah's struggle spread, it sparked conversations about racism, systemic corruption, and the power of individual action. Though Daniels had been exposed, and the legal battle was won, the larger issue of reform was just beginning to take root. Elijah had made his stand, but the fight was far from finished. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was still rippling through Elijah's life. He had faced a confrontation that could have shattered his career, his reputation, his entire world. But in the end, the man who stood before Officer Daniels wasn't the same person who had walked into that room days before. Elijah had always been strong, always had the resolve to push forward in the face of adversity. But now, after everything he had been through, the arrest threat, the scrutiny, the systemic racism he had to navigate every day. Elijah understood just how deeply resilience ran through him. He was no longer just a CEO, a leader in the business world, or a wealthy black man who had defied the odds. He had become an advocate, someone who recognized that his success had never been just for himself, it had always been a means to a greater end, a way to fight back against the systems that worked tirelessly to silence people who looked like him. The confrontation had not only changed Elijah's trajectory, it had changed him as a person. It had forced him to look squarely at the prejudices that had dogged him his whole life. The ones that were deeply ingrained in society, in systems of power, and in the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like him. In the face of those challenges, Elijah had stood tall. His ability to remain composed in the face of blatant racism, to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for others who could never make their voices heard, had been his greatest act of strength. It wasn't about proving his worth to anyone anymore. It was about showing that people like him, black men and women, could no longer be overlooked or undermined by the biases of those who held power. He had taken a stand, and in doing so, had sparked something much bigger. What had started as a personal fight against one officer's actions had turned into a broader fight against a system that had perpetuated the marginalization of entire communities for far too long. Elijah had always believed in the power of hard work, in the idea that if you were diligent enough, strategic enough, you could break through any barrier. But the lesson he had learned in that office with Daniels was even deeper. It wasn't just about individual success, it was about dismantling the systems that held certain people back from even having the chance to succeed. Success didn't just mean getting to the top, it meant using that position to help tear down the walls that kept others from following. The weeks after the confrontation were a whirlwind of change, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Officer Daniels's dismissal was just the tip of the iceberg. His actions were investigated further, and the depth of his bias came to light, leading to a wider conversation about police reform, racial profiling, and the systemic corruption that plagued law enforcement. Elijah's story was being shared across the country, becoming a rallying cry for those who had felt invisible for too long. It was a story of personal strength, but it was also a story of collective action. The people who had rallied behind him, employees, activists, even strangers, had given him the courage to stand firm. As the story spread, so did the calls for reform. Civil rights groups, political leaders, and ordinary citizens were now looking at the system through a different lens. It wasn't just about changing one officer's behavior, it was about changing a culture that had long been tolerated. Elijah's actions, combined with the public outcry, made clear that the time for complacency had passed. The systems of power that upheld racial inequality were being questioned, and for the first time in a long while, there was momentum toward real change. Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. The road to reform would be long and full of resistance, but now, he was more determined than ever to continue the fight. He had learned that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice could make a difference. His voice, his story, and that of the countless others who had been overlooked or discarded by society. In the months that followed, Elijah's role as an advocate grew. He began speaking at rallies, attending forums on racial justice, and becoming an influential voice in the conversation on reform. His business continued to thrive, but his focus had shifted. He was no longer content to simply climb higher in the corporate world. He now felt a responsibility to ensure that others could rise with him. At a major conference on racial justice, Elijah took the stage to speak about his journey. His words carried the weight of everything he had fought for. When I first started in business, I was told that the color of my skin would limit me. I was told that I had to work twice as hard, prove myself, and always be better, just to get half as far. But I've come to realize that it's not about what I've achieved. It's about what we all can achieve. It's about breaking the systems that hold us back. It's about building a world where every person, regardless of their race, their background, their wealth, can rise to their full potential without being judged for things they can't control. The room was silent as his words echoed. The weight of his message sinking in, Elijah had become more than a businessman. He had become a beacon of hope for those who believed their struggles were invisible. But there were still challenges ahead. Elijah knew that no amount of media attention or public speeches could erase the deep-rooted issues of racism that continued to pervade society. But he also knew that progress was possible. The conversations, the confrontations, the revelations, they had all led to a shift in the way people saw the world. And with each step forward, more and more people were joining the movement. Elijah didn't have all the answers. He knew that the fight for racial justice wouldn't be resolved in his lifetime, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting. The conversations were happening, the system was being questioned, and change was beginning to take root. It wasn't a perfect world yet, but it was a world that was finally waking up to the truth. As Elijah looked out over the city from his office window, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that the work he was doing had meaning, that his actions had rippled outward, sparking a conversation that had been long overdue. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been held down by a system designed to make them invisible. His journey had transformed him from a man fighting for his place in the world into a man fighting for everyone's place. The battle wasn't over, but the seed had been planted, and with every fight, with every voice raised in defiance, that seed would continue to grow. Final reflection. Elijah's journey from corporate titan to advocate was one that would inspire others to stand up and use their voices, regardless of the obstacles they faced. His story was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the belief that even in the face of injustice, one person's courage could spark a revolution. But his journey was far from finished. For Elijah, the fight for justice, equality, and reform would continue, fueled by the conviction that no one should ever have to fight alone. The world had changed that day in the office, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who had witnessed the courage it took to stand up against a system designed to hold people down. And as the ripples of his actions continued to spread, one thing was clear. Change was possible. One voice could make a difference, and with determination, resilience, and collective effort, that voice would be heard, now and into the future. The story comes to a close, with a sense of triumph and uncertainty. An ongoing fight for justice. Elijah's courage has inspired change, but the road ahead remains full of challenges. Yet, there is hope, and the foundation for progress has been laid.